Please, Judge Judy. I loved him. I swear I was scared awoken.
You didn't sell a ring. You sold a man's soul and your freedom.
The courtroom was silent, but this wasn't the peaceful silence of an empty room on a lazy afternoon. No, this was the suffocating electric stillness that hangs in the air right before something shatters. The kind of silence where every breath feels too loud, every heartbeat echoes in your chest, and everyone present knows, without anyone saying a word, that what's about to unfold will change everything. David Miller stood at the plaintiff's desk, his calloused hands resting on the worn wooden surface. His shoulders were slightly hunched, but not from defeat, not from weakness. They were bent under the invisible weight of 5 long years of sacrifice, 5 years of waking up before sunrise, 5 years of double shifts at the garage, of coming home with oil-stained uniforms and aching muscles, of reheating cold dinners alone at midnight while the world slept. 5 years of saying no to himself, no to new clothes, no to nights out with friends, no to small luxuries, so that he could say yes to one single shimmering dream. In his right hand he clutched a small velvet box. The lid was open. The inside was empty. And somehow that empty space felt heavier than any engine block he'd ever lifted at the shop. Heavier than any burden he'd carried in his entire working life. Across the aisle at the defendant's table sat Tiffany Sterling. She looked like she had been carefully assembled from the pages of a high-fashion magazine. Every strand of her hair was perfectly positioned. Her makeup was flawless, her skin glowing under the harsh courtroom lights. Draped across her shoulders was a faux fur coat that probably cost more than 3 months of David's rent. Her fingers, adorned with rings that sparkled with every small movement, rested casually on the mahogany table. In front of her lay her smartphone, screen dark but reflective, and more than once during the proceedings she had glanced down at it. Not to check messages, not to silence a call, but to quickly examine her own reflection, to adjust a strand of hair, to practice a slight tilt of her chin. She didn't look nervous, she didn't look guilty, she didn't even look particularly interested. If anything, Tiffany Sterling looked bored. As though this courtroom, this case, this man whose life she had turned upside down, was nothing more than an inconvenient stop between brunch and her next content shoot. The bailiff stood near the wall, spine straight, arms folded behind his back. He was a veteran of this courtroom. He'd seen thousands of cases, hundreds of disputes, countless arguments over money, property, broken promises, and wounded pride. But today, something about the energy in this room made him stand a little taller, pay a little more attention. He could feel it in his bones. The story behind this case wasn't going to be simple, and the ending wasn't going to be quiet. Then the side door opened and Judge Judy Sheindlin entered. The low murmur of whispers, if there had been any, died instantly. Cameras were already rolling, their small red lights glowing like watchful eyes. Somewhere out there beyond these walls, millions of people were tuning in, sitting in living rooms, watching on phones during lunch breaks, streaming on tablets before bed. They were all waiting to see the same thing, the truth. Who was honest, who was lying, and what would justice look like when it finally arrived? Judge Judy took her seat behind the bench, her robe settling around her like armor, her eyes sharp, experienced, missing nothing, scanned the room once. She looked at David, she looked at Tiffany, she looked at the folder Bird had placed in front of her, and without saying a single word, the weight of her presence shifted the entire atmosphere. This wasn't just a case about a missing ring. This was about to become something much, much bigger. To understand how David Miller ended up standing in that courtroom, holding an empty velvet box and fighting back tears, you have to go back. Back before the cameras, before the lawyers, before the accusations. Back to a time when the ring in question wasn't evidence, it was a promise. 5 years earlier, David was just another mechanic in a modest garage on the edge of town. He didn't come from money. His family had never owned property or taken fancy vacations. His childhood home was small, the walls thin enough that you could hear the neighbors arguing, the floors creaky enough that you learned which boards to avoid at night. But what his family lacked in wealth, they made up for in something else: pride and honest work. David's father had been a factory worker until his back gave out. His mother cleaned houses for families who lived in neighborhoods they could never afford. And his grandmother, the person who shaped him more than anyone, had survived things most people only read about in history books. The Great Depression, a world war, decades of scraping by with nothing but resilience and faith. She used to sit with young David on her worn couch, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, and tell him stories. Stories about nights when they weren't sure where the next meal would come from. Stories about neighbors who helped each other even when they had nothing themselves. And stories about one object that had stayed with her through every hardship: a diamond ring. It wasn't a massive stone. It wasn't the kind of gem you'd see in a celebrity engagement announcement, but it was real. And more importantly, it was hers. Her husband, David's grandfather, had given it to her when they were both young and foolish and convinced that love could survive anything. And somehow, through wars and recessions and personal tragedies, that ring had stayed on her finger. It became more than jewelry. It became proof that some things endure when everything else falls apart. When David was a teenager, his grandmother's health began to fail. Her hands shook, her memory softened at the edges. But every now and then she would take off that ring, polish it slowly with a soft cloth, and look at David with eyes that seemed to see straight into his future. "This ring has seen everything," she told him once, her voice thin but steady. "It survived when we had nothing. One day you'll meet someone, and when you're sure, really sure, you'll give this to her, but promise me something, David. Promise me you'll only give it to someone who understands what it cost, not in money, in life," he promised. When she passed away a few years later, the ring came to him. It was wrapped in tissue paper, tucked into a small velvet box that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. The instructions were simple: hold on to it until you find the one. So David held on. He started working at the garage right out of high school. No college degree, no fancy internships, just a willingness to learn and a refusal to give up. He started at the bottom, sweeping floors, fetching tools, watching the older mechanics work, and slowly earned his way up. He learned engines, transmissions, brake systems, electrical wiring. He learned how to diagnose a problem just by listening to the way a car sounded when it started. He learned that there was dignity in working with your hands, in solving problems that other people couldn't. And quietly in the background of his daily grind, he saved. Every paycheck, he set aside a small amount. When his coworkers went out for beers after a long shift, he sometimes stayed behind, eating a sandwich alone in the break room. When his phone screen cracked, he fixed it himself instead of buying a new one. When his shoes wore out, he patched them with tape until he absolutely had to replace them. Every small sacrifice felt like a brick in a wall he was building, a wall around a future he believed in. He used some of that savings to restore his grandmother's ring. The band was repolished. The setting was reinforced. The diamond was cleaned until it sparkled like it must have the day his grandfather first presented it. David didn't know much about jewelry, but he knew this ring deserved to look as beautiful as the story it carried. All he needed now was the right person to give it to. Tiffany Sterling came into David's life the way a summer storm rolls in, sudden, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. She showed up at the garage one afternoon with a problem. Her imported luxury SUV, a sleek, overpriced machine that looked wildly out of place among the dusty pickups and practical sedans in the lot, was making a strange noise. The dealership had quoted her a repair cost that made her visibly annoyed. Someone had recommended David's shop as a cheaper, trustworthy alternative. When she stepped through the garage door, it was like the fluorescent lights dimmed for a second. She wore clothes that didn't belong in a place that smelled like motor oil and rubber. Her heels clicked against the concrete floor. Her sunglasses were pushed up into her hair, and her phone case had a designer logo that David had only ever seen in online ads. Everything about her screamed different world. But what caught David's attention wasn't the money she obviously had. It was the way she laughed. He made some light-hearted joke about her car being a little dramatic, a gentle tease, nothing more, and she laughed. Not a polite, distant laugh, a real one. Warm, surprised, like she hadn't expected to be amused and was genuinely pleased to be wrong. They talked while the team checked her car. She explained her work: content creation, brand partnerships, building an online presence. She used words like engagement rate and algorithm and aesthetic. Most of it didn't fully register with David, but he liked how passionate she seemed. He understood passion. He understood caring about your work, even if other people didn't always see why. One visit turned into two. Two turned into three. She started coming by the garage even when her car was perfectly fine, just to say hello, to chat, to bring coffee sometimes. They exchanged numbers. Texts led to calls. Calls led to dinners. Dinners led to something that felt, to David at least, like the beginning of forever. Over the next 5 years, their lives became intertwined in ways David never fully questioned. He was the steady one, the reliable presence, the person who picked her up from the airport at 2 a.m. without complaining. The person who listened when she vented about a post that didn't perform well, or a brand deal that fell through, or a comment section that turned unexpectedly negative. He didn't always understand the specifics of her world, but he tried. He showed up. He cared. Tiffany, meanwhile, lived in a universe built on perception. What mattered wasn't just what was real, it was what looked real. She curated everything: her photos, her captions, her outfits, her relationships. She talked constantly about the brand, about staying relevant, about not falling behind in the endless race for attention. Sometimes she would gently suggest that David dress differently, that his car was not really fitting the image. That maybe, just maybe, he should consider presenting himself in a more polished way. He didn't take it as an insult, at least not consciously. He loved her. He wanted her to be happy. If upgrading his wardrobe a little made her more comfortable, wasn't that just part of being a good partner? If skipping nights out with friends meant more time with her, wasn't that a worthwhile trade? He told himself these sacrifices were investments in their shared future. And all the while, his grandmother's ring waited patiently in its velvet box. One evening, after 5 years of late-night phone calls and long drives and quiet compromises, David decided it was time. He planned everything carefully. A weekend trip to a quiet coastal town. A sunset picnic on the beach, away from crowds and cameras and distractions. He spent hours choosing the right spot, packing her favorite snacks, rehearsing what he would say. His hands trembled slightly when he slipped the velvet box into his jacket pocket that morning. When the moment finally came, the sky was painted in shades of gold and soft pink. the waves rolling in slow and steady like a heartbeat. David dropped to one knee on the cool sand, his voice catching in his throat as he opened the box and showed her the ring that had survived generations. He told her about his grandmother, about the struggles she had endured, about the promise he had made, about every double shift and skipped dinner and delayed purchase that had led to this moment. He told her that this ring wasn't just metal and stone, it was history. It was proof that love could survive anything if both people were willing to fight for it. Tiffany gasped, tears welled in her eyes. Her hands flew to her mouth in what looked like genuine shock. She said yes before he even finished speaking. He slid the ring onto her finger and for a moment everything felt perfect. Then her phone came out. She angled herself against the sunset, adjusted the ring so it caught the fading light and snapped a photo. Then another, then another. Within minutes a post was live. When hard work meets love, I said yes. #forever engaged, dreams come true. The comments poured in, heart emojis, congratulations, strangers calling them goals. David watched her scroll through the reactions, her face glowing with satisfaction. He tried to ignore the small knot forming in his stomach. This was a happy moment, he reminded himself. She was just excited. She wanted to share their joy with the world. There was nothing wrong with that, right? For the next few weeks, everything seemed to accelerate. Tiffany threw herself into wedding planning with the same energy she brought to her content. She pinned venue ideas, dress options, color schemes. She talked about turning their engagement into a series of posts, maybe even a vlog documenting the journey to their big day. She mentioned the possibility of brand partnerships, sponsored flowers, sponsored catering, maybe even a sponsored honeymoon. David nodded along, trying to keep up. It was overwhelming, but he figured this was just how she processed happiness. She was excited, she was dreaming out loud. He was just grateful to be part of those dreams. Then exactly 3 weeks after the proposal, his phone rang in the middle of a shift. It was Tiffany, crying, hyperventilating. Her words tumbled out between gasps and sobs, and it took David several seconds to piece together what she was saying. She had gone to her gym, a high-end, members-only fitness club with marble floors and eucalyptus towels, and a monthly fee that made David's stomach clench whenever he thought about it. She had locked her belongings in a locker, gone into the steam room to relax, and when she came back, the locker was open. Her bag was on the floor, some items were scattered, and the ring, his grandmother's ring, was gone. For a long moment, David couldn't speak. His mind went completely blank, like a television losing its signal. Then all at once a wave of panic crashed into him. Not anger at her, he didn't even think to be angry at her, just sheer, overwhelming guilt. He should have insisted she leave the ring at home, he should have bought insurance for it, he should have done something, anything to prevent this. He left work immediately, drove to the gym, and found Tiffany in the lobby, mascara streaked down her cheeks, surrounded by concerned staff. He held her while she cried. He spoke to the manager. He insisted they check the security cameras. He filed a police report himself, providing every detail he could remember. The ring's history, its approximate value, photographs of his grandmother wearing it decades ago. Days passed, then weeks. The police followed up a few times, but there were no strong leads. The camera footage showed people coming and going, but nothing conclusive. No clear suspect, no obvious theft. During this time, David noticed something strange. At first, Tiffany was appropriately devastated. She cried, she apologized, she said she felt terrible for letting something so precious out of her sight. But as the days went on, her grief seemed to fade. She started talking about other things, upcoming events, travel plans, a new content series she wanted to launch. She mentioned more than once that the negative energy around the loss was affecting her work, and that she needed to move forward for the sake of her mental health and her brand. David, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about it. He lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, imagining his grandmother's ring in a pawn shop window somewhere, or melted down for scrap, or sitting in a stranger's drawer with no story attached. The thought made him physically sick. And then he did something that, looking back, he realized was both generous and naive. He took out a loan. He reasoned that Tiffany shouldn't have to carry the guilt of the loss forever. That maybe if the original ring was truly gone, he could at least replace it with something new. Something that could symbolize their future, even if it didn't carry his grandmother's history. He signed papers he barely understood. He committed to monthly payments that would stretch his already tight budget. He never once accused Tiffany of anything, never once questioned her story. He loved her too much to see clearly. What David didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known, was that someone else in town had started paying attention. The pawn shop on Miller Street was a small, cluttered place, run by a man named Earl and his daughter, Jessica. They'd been in the business for decades, buying and selling everything from old guitars to vintage watches to estate jewelry. Jessica handled most of the day-to-day operations now, and she had developed a sharp eye for people who didn't quite add up. A few weeks after the supposed theft, a woman had walked into the shop carrying a ring. She was well-dressed, confident, and spoke with the kind of easy authority that suggested she wasn't used to being questioned. She said she wanted to sell an old piece of jewelry, something she'd inherited but no longer wanted. Jessica examined the ring carefully. It was beautiful, a classic setting, a modest but genuine diamond, a band that showed signs of age but had been recently restored. The woman provided an ID, a driver's license, and signed the necessary paperwork. She collected $4,000 in cash and left without looking back. Something about the transaction bothered Jessica, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Then a few days later, she saw a flyer. It was posted on the bulletin board at the local diner where she sometimes grabbed lunch. A photograph of a ring, the same ring she'd just bought. Below it the words, "Stolen heirloom, family treasure, please help." The contact information led to a garage across town. The name at the bottom was David Miller. Jessica's stomach dropped. She went back to the shop and pulled up the transaction records. The ID the woman had used didn't match any Tiffany Sterling, but the face in Jessica's memory certainly did. She'd seen that face before on social media, in sponsored posts, smiling next to expensive products and exotic locations. She did some digging. She found Tiffany's public accounts. She found the engagement announcement from weeks ago. She found the same ring, the one now sitting in her shop's inventory, on Tiffany Sterling's finger in a sunset photo. And she found something else, the thumbprint. Every pawn shop in the city was required to collect a thumbprint for high-value transactions. It was a security measure, a way to trace items if they turned out to be stolen. The woman who sold the ring had used a fake name and a forged ID, but she'd left behind the one thing she couldn't fake. Jessica called her father. Together, they contacted a private security database they sometimes used for verification. The thumbprint matched records associated with Tiffany Sterling. The ring hadn't been stolen by a stranger. It had been sold by the woman who was supposed to cherish it. And so, weeks later, they all found themselves here. In this silent, electric courtroom, cameras rolling, the world watching. David told his story first. He spoke quietly, his voice cracking at times, his eyes wet but his composure intact. He explained the ring's history, his grandmother's struggles, his years of saving, the proposal, the call about the theft, the police report, the loan. Every sentence felt like reopening a wound. When it was Tiffany's turn, she slipped smoothly into performance mode. She described her version of events with the practiced ease of someone used to speaking to an audience. The gym, the locker, the steam room. The horror of discovering her things disturbed. She spoke about trauma, about fear, about the toll the situation had taken on her mental health and her career. Her words were polished. Her tone was sympathetic. To someone not paying close attention, it might have sounded entirely convincing, but Judge Judy was paying very close attention. She began with simple questions. "Ms. Sterling, you say you reported this theft to the gym. Do you have any written correspondence from management, any insurance claim, any documentation at all beyond what Mr. Miller filed with the police?" Tiffany's eyes flickered just for a fraction of a second toward the exit. Then she launched into an explanation about internal handling and not wanting negative publicity and protecting her brand. Judge Judy listened. Then she turned a page in the folder in front of her. "I have here," she said slowly, "a series of photographs dated the exact day you claim you were too traumatized to function normally." She held up the photos, a rooftop pool party in Las Vegas, Tiffany in the center of the frame, laughing, holding a bottle of champagne, standing close to a man who was clearly not David. She looked radiant, carefree, celebrating. The courtroom stirred. "I also have," Judge Judy continued, "bank records showing a $4,000 cash deposit to your account made at a drive-through ATM in the middle of the night just before your trip to Las Vegas." Tiffany tried to explain. "The money was a loan from a friend. The posts were pre-scheduled. The trip was planned before the incident." Each excuse sounded thinner than the last. Then came the final piece. Bird handed over a document, a pawn shop receipt, a Know Your Customer form, a forged ID, and a thumbprint that matched Tiffany Sterling exactly. The air in the courtroom seemed to freeze. Judge Judy looked directly at Tiffany. "You didn't just sell this ring, Ms. Sterling. You used a fake identity to do it. You filed a false police report. You watched this man, the man you were supposed to marry, suffer under guilt and debt, knowing the entire time that you were the one who had taken his family's legacy and traded it for a weekend of pretending to be someone you're not." Tiffany's composure finally cracked. She shouted that the ring was a gift, that once a gift is given it belongs to the recipient, that she could do whatever she wanted with her own property. Judge Judy shut her down calmly but firmly. "An engagement ring," she explained, "is typically considered a conditional gift under the law. It is given in anticipation of marriage. If the marriage doesn't happen, especially due to the dishonesty of the recipient, the condition is not fulfilled. The gift can be ordered returned, and that's before we even get into the fraud, the false report, and the forged documents." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "You didn't just break this man's heart, Miss Sterling, you broke the law. And actions, as they say, have consequences." The verdict was delivered without drama but with absolute clarity. Judge Judy ordered Tiffany to repay David $15,000, the appraised value of the ring. She also confirmed that through proper legal channels, the ring itself had been secured as evidence. Because it had been obtained through a fraudulent transaction, the pawn shop was required to hold it. It would be returned to David free of charge as property obtained through criminal means. Tiffany protested. She talked about her reputation. Her career, how this would ruin her online presence. But none of that changed the evidence. None of that erased the thumbprint, the photos, the receipts. As the bailiff moved to escort her out, David remained standing at his table for a long moment. He looked down at the empty velvet box in his hand. Soon it wouldn't be empty anymore. His grandmother's ring, the ring that had survived decades of hardship, would come home. But more than the ring, something else had been restored: his sense of self. He had made mistakes, he had trusted too easily. He had ignored signs that in hindsight seemed obvious, but none of that made him weak, none of that made him a fool, it made him human. A human who loved deeply, gave generously, and believed in the best of people. Walking out of that courtroom, David didn't look back at the cameras, didn't look back at Tiffany, didn't look back at the chaos swirling in her wake. He looked forward, toward a future where his hard work would be respected, where his sacrifices would be honored, where his grandmother's legacy would be protected. This story stretched across a courtroom, across 5 years of hope and heartbreak, across the distance between what people show the world and who they really are, carries a message that matters. Love is not just poetry and pretty pictures. It's not just hashtags and heart emojis. It's responsibility, it's honesty, it's what you do when no one is watching. And if you've ever been in David's position, if you've ever given more than you got back, trusted someone who didn't deserve it, felt foolish for caring, let this story remind you of something important. You're not foolish for loving deeply. But you are allowed to walk away when that love is betrayed. You are allowed to protect what you've worked for. You are allowed to demand that your sacrifices mean something. And for anyone watching who thinks kindness is weakness, who sees generosity as an opportunity to exploit, who believes that charisma and confidence can outrun the truth, remember how this story ended. Not with a dramatic explosion, not with revenge or cruelty, but with a quiet, firm statement: the truth matters. It may take time, it may require patience, but eventually it arrives. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the people in your own life who truly deserve your trust and the ones who might not do one simple thing, drop a comment below saying truth wins, not to celebrate anyone's downfall, but to celebrate accountability, to stand with every person who has ever given more than they got back, to remind the world that integrity still matters. Hit the like button so more people can see that there's still space for honesty in a world obsessed with image. And if you want more stories where the quiet, hardworking person finally gets the justice they deserve, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because in our next video, we're diving into a case where someone with a powerful last name believes rules don't apply to them, and discovers the hard way that in a courtroom, everyone stands on the same floor. Until then, remember this: a good man's kindness is not a weakness, it is a strength. And when that kindness finally turns toward the truth, even the most carefully built lies don't stand a chance.